The moment I opened the bathroom door, I knew another woman had been here. It wasn't some dramatic thing like lipstick on a glass or a bra under the couch. No, it was the perfume. Lavender and smoke. Subtle, expensive, and not what Loretta wears. Loretta hates lavender. I stood there for a second, just breathing it in like an idiot, trying to convince myself I was wrong, that it was maybe a new shampoo or some candle she bought on sale. But there was no candle, and that wasn't shampoo. I didn't say anything right away. What could I say? Hey, babe, did another woman just pee in our bathroom while I was out getting us oat milk? So I did what I always do. I said nothing. Instead, I made breakfast, toasted the sourdough she liked, brewed her pretentious, small-batch coffee, played the good husband, even though my hands were shaking the whole time. When she walked in, all tousled and humming, I watched her closely, like a detective in a cheap thriller. She looked fresh. Too fresh. Hair still damp from a shower I hadn't heard. I asked where she went last night, even though I already knew she hadn't come home until 3:27 a.m. Yes, I checked the Nest Cam. She smiled. I stayed over at Nina's. We had wine and watched that trashy dating show you hate. I nodded, took a bite of toast, didn't mention the camera, or the Uber receipt that pinged my email at 2:48. Different drop-off address. Not Nina's. I wanted to scream, to cry, to ask her who he was. Instead, I said, hope you had fun. She kissed me on the cheek, same one she probably kissed him with, and whispered, you're too good to me. And that was it. Until 4 days later, when she walked in wearing a dress I'd never seen before and casually said, I have a date tonight. Not a work dinner. Not a girls' night. A date. She said it like she was telling me she was out of toothpaste. I looked up at her, still holding a fork midair, and I didn't cry. I didn't shout. But what I said next, it changed everything. There was this strange, hollow silence after she said it. I have a date tonight. She didn't flinch when the words came out of her mouth. Not even a pause to soften the blow, no glance to check my reaction. Just that vacant confidence of someone who has already had this conversation in their head 100 times and doesn't care how it lands. She turned to the hallway mirror, adjusted one earring, and smoothed the front of her dress like nothing had just detonated in the kitchen. I just sat there, still holding the fork, a piece of scrambled egg halfway to my mouth. My mind wasn't racing. It was stalled, like my body had unplugged from itself. I wasn't sad. Not yet. I wasn't angry. I wasn't anything. Just there. You're really doing this? I asked, not even recognizing my own voice. It sounded soft. Not broken. Worse. Dull. Defeated. She sighed like she was being forced to explain something obvious. I've been unhappy, Milton. We both know that. I don't want to lie anymore. I need to feel something again. He makes me feel alive. There it was. That line. He makes me feel alive. Like she was in a Nicholas Sparks novel, and I was the sad piano soundtrack in the background. I think that was the first moment it actually stung. I stood up and walked to the sink. Rinsed my plate. Not because I cared about dishes, but because I needed something to do with my hands. My brain was unraveling, thread by thread, but I needed to keep the outside calm. How long? I asked. She didn't answer. Loretta. She turned toward me. Met my eyes for the first time in weeks. 3 months. 3 months. I nodded slowly. That was around the same time she stopped watching shows with me at night. The same week she forgot my birthday dinner because of a client crisis. God, I'd spent that night eating store-bought cake by myself, blaming it on her workload. I even defended her when my sister called her cold. And all the while, she was busy feeling alive. I leaned back against the counter, staring at the cracked tile by the sink I kept promising to fix. So what now? You want my blessing? You want me to say I understand? I don't expect anything. I'm just telling you because I'm tired of sneaking around. I'm being honest with you now. That counts for something. Go ahead, then, I said quietly. Have your date. Her eyes narrowed. That's it. I looked at her. Really looked. This woman who once cried when I wrote her a stupid poem in a Valentine's card. Who used to pull my hand to her chest in the middle of the night just to feel safe. Now she was standing there in a new dress, smelling like foreign perfume, waiting to be dismissed like it was all so simple. That's it, I repeated. You're free to go? She opened her mouth like she was going to say something. Maybe an apology, maybe an insult, maybe just a defense of her so-called honesty, but no words came. She grabbed her bag, her keys, and walked out the door. I didn't move. I didn't cry. I didn't scream into a pillow or punch a wall. I just walked into the bedroom, opened the drawer where I kept my journals, and pulled out the one with the leather cover, the one she gave me on our second anniversary. That's where I began writing down everything I knew, every detail I had buried, every sign I had ignored. Because if she wanted to feel alive, she was about to learn how fast the ground could fall out from under her feet. I spent the entire night writing, not in a frenzy, not out of rage. It was methodical, almost meditative. The pen scratched across the paper like a metronome while the world outside went quiet. No distractions, no texts, no Loretta asking why I was still awake or if I'd eaten dinner. Just silence and the sound of truth finally bleeding onto the page. I didn't plan to keep track of her lies. Not at first, but I'd noticed the shifts, the late meetings, the guarded phone, the way she started sleeping in silky pajamas even when we weren't touching. Loretta had always been warm. Then suddenly, she became rehearsed. Like every word was a performance. So, weeks ago, when the gut feeling wouldn't leave me alone, I started documenting things. Quietly. Not because I wanted to catch her, but because I needed to know I wasn't crazy. The Uber receipts were the easiest. She never turned off the email notifications, and I had access to our shared inbox. I created a folder. Then came screenshots. Names of unfamiliar restaurants. One bar in particular showed up 5 times in 2 weeks, a place she claimed she hated because of this sweaty crowd. Funny how preferences change when desire gets involved. Then there were the voice memos. I had accidentally recorded one. Genuinely. She called me while I was at work, and I answered using my AirPods while my phone was already screen recording for something else. I forgot to turn it off. The result was 10 minutes of her talking about him. Not by name, but enough to understand. The way her voice changed. Softer. Breathier. I'd never heard her sound like that when she talked about me. After that, I stopped hoping I was wrong. So I began to prepare, not out of vengeance, but out of a desperate need to reclaim some sense of reality. A folder under the floorboard in my closet. I labeled it June, so she'd never suspect. Inside, the memos, the screenshots, even a printed copy of her WhatsApp messages I'd recovered when her laptop synced to our shared network. She never knew I had access. She never cared enough to ask. I didn't read the messages in full. I couldn't. Just the first few lines were enough to feel like acid in my stomach. You make me feel like I'm not invisible. Sometimes I wish I'd met you first. He's a good man, but I'm so tired of being bored. I was the good man. I was the boredom. She was already gone long before she said the word date. I closed the journal that night and placed it on top of the folder. Stared at it for a long time. It wasn't just evidence. It was the graveyard of every stupid thing I still believed about love. At 3:11 a.m., the lock turned. I didn't get out of bed. I just listened. Her heels clicked lightly on the hardwood floor. No rush, no guilt. She paused in the hallway. I heard her open the fridge. A bottle clinked, probably wine. She always drinks after. I imagined her reflection in the microwave glass, hair still tousled, lips smeared, lying to herself that this is just temporary, that she still has time to fix it. She didn't check if I was awake. She didn't whisper my name. I laid there for hours. But the worst part wasn't the betrayal. It was realizing that I hadn't lost her tonight. I'd already lost her months ago, and now I had to decide what to do with the truth sitting beneath my floor. The next morning, I woke up before she did. Not because I slept well, I didn't sleep at all, but because I couldn't bear the idea of pretending, of watching her stretch and yawn like the night before didn't exist. Like she hadn't come home smelling like unfamiliar cologne with a smear of burgundy lipstick that wasn't the shade she usually wears. I didn't want to watch her make coffee and hum some indie pop song while I sat there pretending to be fine. I didn't want her smile. I didn't want her guilt. I didn't want anything from her anymore. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours, staring at the phone in my hand, scrolling through her contact. My thumb hovered over the call button. Not to confront her. Not yet. But to call someone else entirely. I considered dialing her mother, a woman who once told me I was the only good decision Loretta ever made. I imagined the conversation. I'd tell her everything. The late nights. The lies. The way her daughter sat across from me and told me she had a date like it was a dentist appointment. But I didn't call. Instead, I recorded a voice memo. Not for anyone else. For her. I hit record and just talked. I told her everything I was too afraid to say to her face. That I knew. That I'd known. That I'd been watching her slip away day by day while pretending to be blind. That the worst part wasn't that she'd betrayed me. It was that she made me feel like I wasn't worth the truth. That I was just the placeholder husband. The man who fixed her car and filed her taxes while someone else made her laugh in the dark. I told her about the folder. I told her about the floorboard. And then I said something I hadn't even admitted to myself yet. I could forgive you, Loretta. I really could. Not because you deserve it, but because I don't want to carry this poison in me forever. But if you lie to me again, if you look me in the eye and deny everything like I'm some oblivious idiot, then I'll burn this whole fantasy to the ground. You don't get to cheat and still be the hero. I stopped recording. I didn't send it, but I didn't delete it either. Instead, I connected my phone to the Bluetooth speaker in the living room, the one she always uses when she's getting ready for work, and I queued up the memo, set it on a 30-second delay, and went for a walk. I didn't know what I expected to happen. Maybe I thought she'd break down crying. Maybe she'd scream. Maybe she'd pack a bag and leave before I came back. Or maybe, and this is what scared me most, maybe she'd do nothing. Maybe she'd listen, blink, and go about her day. Because the truth is, Loretta had grown so good at pretending, I wasn't sure she remembered how to feel anything real anymore. I wandered the neighborhood for an hour, circling streets I hadn't walked in years. I passed the cafe where we had our first date, the bookstore where she once spent 2 hours picking out a novel and then never read it. Everything felt distant, like I was a ghost floating through a life I no longer recognized. By the time I got home, the house was quiet. Too quiet. The speaker was still on. My phone was on the floor. And Loretta was sitting on the edge of the couch, pale, eyes rimmed red, hands trembling. "I didn't know you knew," she whispered, voice raw. "I knew," I said. "I just didn't know what kind of person you'd choose to be when the truth caught up to you." She opened her mouth to speak, but for once in our marriage, she had no words. That was the first time I saw her afraid. And part of me hated how good that felt. She stayed on that couch for almost 15 minutes without moving. I watched her from the kitchen, the silence between us thick enough to choke on. The way she sat, legs pulled in, arms wrapped around her stomach like she was holding herself together. I'd never seen her look small before. Loretta had always taken up space, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in a way that made people notice when she entered a room. But now she looked like a shadow of herself, and I couldn't figure out if that was guilt or just the shock of being caught by someone she'd assumed was too soft to fight back. Eventually, she spoke, and her voice didn't have that usual sharpness to it. It was tentative, like she was choosing every word with tweezers. She said she didn't plan for it to happen, that it started with conversation, with a coworker who listened, who made her laugh when she felt invisible at home. She said she never meant to hurt me, that she'd been feeling lost, unappreciated, unseen. The same script everyone uses when they want to justify their betrayal without wearing the weight of it. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask her how she could say she felt invisible when I bent over backwards to keep her world comfortable. I wanted to throw every receipt, every favor, every quiet act of devotion right in her face. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned on the counter, arms crossed, and asked her a question I knew would hurt more than yelling ever could. If I hadn't found out, would you have ever stopped? She didn't answer. That was enough. I told her I didn't care about the man, not his name, not his job, not his version of the story. I didn't care about their dinner dates or their hotel rooms or the text messages they sent while I was folding her laundry. I told her I cared about the moment she decided I didn't deserve the truth. That's when the marriage died, not when she slept with him, but when she made the decision to do it and still came home to kiss me goodnight. She cried, not the theatrical kind. It was a quiet breakdown, shoulders shaking, lips pressed together, trying to control herself. And maybe, in some twisted part of me, I wanted that. I wanted her to finally feel the shame she never let herself feel. For months, she got to live in two worlds while I sat alone in one, confused and second-guessing my every move. This was the reality check. Then she asked me if we could go to counseling. That almost made me laugh. It wasn't funny, it was surreal. Like watching someone try to glue back together a glass vase with chewing gum and hope you won't notice the cracks. She said the usual lines. That we had history. That we owed it to ourselves. That maybe this pain could be the thing that wakes us up. But I wasn't asleep. I was wide awake when she said she had a date. I was wide awake when she came home hours later and didn't even shower before crawling into bed beside me. I was wide awake while she whispered his name in her sleep. Yes, that happened. And she never knew I heard it. So I told her no. Not now. Maybe not ever. That I needed space. That I wasn't going to be manipulated into patching a sinking ship just because she suddenly realized she might drown in the wreckage. She asked where I was going. I told her I had somewhere to be. She thought I meant a hotel or my brother's place. But I didn't. I had an appointment. One she didn't know about. Not with a lawyer. Not yet. Something worse. Something she would never see coming. I didn't pack a bag. Didn't slam the door. I walked out quietly, like I was just going for a walk, and in a way I was. But not the kind Loretta thought. I didn't even check if she followed me with her eyes as I left. I hoped she did. I hoped she watched me walk away and wondered where I was going. I hoped the uncertainty gnawed at her the same way her lies had gnawed at me for months. My hands were trembling, but not from nerves. It was adrenaline. Like something deep inside me had finally kicked into gear after being stalled for far too long. I took a bus across town to a neighborhood I hadn't been to in years. The streets were quieter there, residential, overgrown lawns, sun-bleached fences. I passed an old bakery I didn't know still existed and a mailbox that looked like it hadn't seen a letter in a decade. And then I found the house. The man who lived there was named Kellen. I'd found him online through a post buried in a forum I'd only read out of desperation. He wasn't a private investigator, not in the traditional sense. He called himself a digital analyst, which sounded like something someone made up to avoid legal paperwork. But when I read the testimonials buried on subreddits, people swore by him. Said he could connect dots the police wouldn't touch. Said he found things husbands weren't meant to find. He opened the door before I even knocked. Skinny guy, late 40s, with eyes that didn't blink enough and a coffee mug that said Trust Issues Club. He didn't say hello, just motioned for me to come in. His office was more of a den, cluttered, cables everywhere, two huge monitors glowing with lines of code I couldn't begin to understand. It smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet. But when I sat down, he looked at me, really looked, and said the words I wasn't ready for. She's been talking to more than one guy. I didn't speak. He kept going. Your wife uses a secondary Instagram account. It's private, locked to a group of maybe 6 or 7 people. But she uses it a lot. The geotags match locations from the Uber receipts you sent me. The messages are encrypted, but we're working on pulling them through metadata. I finally managed to say something. More than one. He nodded. The one you know about, the coworker. He's just the main thread. But there's at least 2 others. One of them she was messaging last year. The other one, I think it's ongoing. Not physical, maybe, but emotional. Definitely intimate. I sat there like someone had punched me in the chest. Because in my mind, I'd created this narrative. One mistake, one affair, one moment where she lost her way and maybe, just maybe, I could forgive her for it. But this wasn't a mistake. This was a pattern, a personality, a machine of manipulation that had been running longer than I realized. He handed me a file, thick, stapled, printed screenshots, photos I hadn't seen, some selfies, some from bars, one from a hotel mirror, captioned in a private story I was never meant to see. Living my real life tonight. Real life. So what was I then? Just the placeholder? The backup plan? The tax-friendly housemate who didn't ask too many questions? I didn't cry. That part of me was dry now, like a well tapped too many times. I just stared at the folder, letting the weight of it press into my hands until my fingers felt numb. Before I left, Kellen asked if I wanted him to keep digging. I told him no, because I didn't need more proof. I needed a plan. On the ride home, I didn't think about revenge. I thought about exposure. Not in some dramatic, public confrontation kind of way. No screaming at dinner parties. No Instagram rants. Just quiet, surgical honesty. The kind that doesn't need to shout to destroy. Because the thing about people like Loretta, the ones who build their lives on curated appearances and selective truths, is that they don't fear anger. They fear the one thing they can't control. Consequence. And I had just decided she was going to meet hers. When I got home that night, Loretta was in the kitchen, lighting candles like nothing had happened. There was music playing, some soft jazz playlist she used to put on when we were still pretending to be romantic. The table was set. Wine glasses, napkins folded into perfect triangles. And in the center, a roast chicken that smelled too perfect to be casual. She turned when I walked in, lips curved into a nervous smile. Like a student waiting to be graded on a test she already knew she flunked. I made your favorite, she said softly. Figured we could talk. Talk. The irony made me nauseous. I'd spent months begging her to talk. Back then, she'd always claimed she was tired, or distracted, or just not in the mood for heavy conversations. But now that the illusion had shattered, now that she knew I knew, suddenly she wanted to light candles and have a heart-to-heart over poultry. Still, I sat. I let her pour the wine. I even let her serve my plate, hands shaking just enough to betray her composure. She tried to keep things light at first, asked how my day was. I told her it was productive. She didn't ask what I meant by that. And then, somewhere between the second glass of wine and her third attempt at small talk, I pulled out the envelope. Just one. Thick. Cream-colored. Unassuming. I placed it beside her fork without a word. She stared at it for a long moment before reaching for it, her fingers hesitant like it might burn her. When she opened it and saw what was inside, the screenshots, the dates, the Instagram backups, the printed WhatsApp transcripts with every redacted name reinserted, her entire body deflated. Her eyes scanned the pages with growing horror. One hand went to her mouth. She looked like she might vomit. But I didn't flinch. I didn't scream. I just watched. When she finally looked at me, her voice was barely a whisper. How did you? Does it matter? I asked. You didn't stop. Not after the first guy. Not after the second. Not even when I asked you directly. You chose this, Loretta. Not once. Repeatedly. Tears started forming in her eyes, but I stopped her with a raised hand. No, you don't get to cry. Not tonight. Not here. You don't get to cry when you built this house of mirrors and hoped I wouldn't notice the glass. I was lonely, she said, desperate. You were distant. You were always. Always what? I snapped, my voice sharp for the first time in months. Always here. Always loyal. Always trying to make you happy while you twisted the knife behind my back. The room went still. Then I leaned forward, lowered my voice, and said something I hadn't planned to say until that exact moment. I'm not divorcing you. She froze. Confused. What? You heard me. I'm not leaving. You don't get to just eject from this and paint me as the bitter ex. You don't get to run away with your curated narrative while I get whispers and pitiful looks from people who never heard my side. She blinked rapidly. Then what are you saying? I'm saying you're going to live in the consequences you created. We're staying in this house. You'll sleep in the guest room. We'll split bills. We'll share space. But don't talk to me unless it's necessary. Don't ask me for favors. Don't smile like this can be salvaged. You ended the marriage. I'm just letting you feel what it's like to live with the corpse of it. Her lips parted like she wanted to protest. But she didn't. Because deep down, she knew it was fair. She knew this wasn't punishment. It was the mirror she'd been running from. And then, as she sat there, surrounded by her lies, her silence, her broken web, I picked up my wine glass, looked her dead in the eye, and smiled. To the truth, I said. May it finally make itself comfortable here. 2 weeks passed. 2 long, echoing, quiet weeks where the air in our home hung thick with things unsaid. Loretta stayed mostly silent. She moved around like a tenant in someone else's apartment, careful not to touch anything, not to make noise, not to remind me she was there unless absolutely necessary. She cooked for herself. She did her laundry when I wasn't home. She stopped wearing perfume, and she never brought up the other men again. But I didn't do any of it for her. I started waking up early, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I walked every morning. No headphones, no music. Just the sound of gravel under my shoes and a sky that didn't care about my broken marriage. I went back to therapy. Real therapy, not the kind where you pretend you're fine so you don't cry in front of a stranger. I talked. I really talked. About the years I spent trying to be enough. About the quiet pain of loving someone who slowly teaches you how to disappear. And something unexpected happened. I started laughing again. Not right away. But one morning, a squirrel fell off my fence trying to steal from the bird feeder I never refilled, and I laughed so hard I scared the neighbor's cat. And in that moment, standing in my mismatched socks and holding a lukewarm cup of instant coffee, I realized I was okay. I wasn't broken, just bent for too long. Loretta eventually asked to speak. Not to win me back. She knew that wasn't happening, but to apologize. Truly. No defense. No deflection. Just raw regret. I told her I appreciated it. I meant it. But I also told her I didn't need it to heal. We filed the paperwork a month later. No fights. No drama. Just a quiet agreement that our chapter had ended long before the final page was written. A few weeks after the divorce was finalized, I packed a small bag and took a train upstate. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I booked a cabin with no internet, no television, just a fireplace and a stack of notebooks. That weekend, I wrote the first pages of a story that had nothing to do with heartbreak. It was fiction, pure fiction, about a man who survives the collapse of everything he thought made him whole, and slowly, without revenge or rage, builds a new life from the pieces. Not to prove anything to anyone, just to see if he could. And you know what? He did.